Hi everyone, my name is Emilie Martel. I'm from Concordia University. I am the senior lead for CEGEP partnerships. And so I work to liaise with CEGEPs and to try and facilitate collaborations between the CEGEPs and Concordia, so both on the Francophone and the Anglophone side. Thank you very much to everyone for attending this session today. And so in recognizing the diversity of communities and the challenges they face, as well as the opportunities for development, there is a strong need to clearly define what constitutes a vital community, especially in the context of English-speaking minorities. And so today we have Richard Bourhis and Jan Warnke, who will be addressing two very interesting topics related to this. So Richard Bourhis is an emeritus professor at the Department of Psychology of the Université du Québec à Montréal. He obtained a BSc in psychology at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, and a PhD in social psychology at the University of Bristol, England. Bourhis publishes on acculturation and immigrant-host community relations, cross-cultural communication, discrimination, intergroup relations, and language planning. At QUESCREN, he is a member of the advisory board, the Interlevel Educational Table, also known as ILET, and the program committee for this forum and research member. Dr. Bourhis will first propose a theoretical framework and indicators used to measure vitality. So following his presentation, Professor Warnke will be offering also his presentation, and I will ask you to please keep your questions for the end of the session. Thank you very much, everyone. Dr. Bourhis.
Bonjour, hi. I always say that. Bonjour, hi. I'm going to be talking about vitality, and we created the construct of vitality 40 years ago, and I've just come back from a conference more in a sort of a language and social psychology conference where we've been using the construct for these 40 years. So I'll say a few words about the group vitality construct. I'll focus on objective vitality, but we also have exo-vitality and ego-vitality, and we might say a few words about some of those elements. But I'll say something about why we did it. So back literally in 1977, I was in Europe doing my PhD at the University of Bristol, and I was doing a lot of research with language minorities and majorities in Brussels, in Belgium, in Switzerland, in the UK, in Wales. And we were dealing with a lot of different language groups and language minorities dealing with language majorities. And at that time, when we looked at the literature, it was very difficult to organize our thoughts about the relative strength of different language communities in contact. So we decided to construct this idea of the group vitality. So the first thing we thought about as an idea was that the vitality of a language group is that which makes a group likely to behave as a distinctive and active collective entity in an intergroup situation. Now, of course, this is more of a social psychological construct because you're saying, how do you go from structural variables about vitality to actual behavior? So I'll get to the structural variables. But these are some of the premises we had with the idea of group vitality. Now, another thing we can say is that over these 40 years, the construct of group vitality has been appropriated by many different language and cultural communities around the world, and everybody has brought in their own creativity and their own specificity in adapting the construct to their need. And to me, this was a very good sign because it meant that the construct was heuristic, that it was useful. But there's no orthodoxy about what it should be, okay? So other than the sheer fundamentals that I'm going to talk about, which is the tool of social analysis that we're using with group vitality. So one idea we had about the group vitality construct was that the more vitality a language group enjoys, the more likely it will survive and thrive as a collective entity in the intergroup situation. So you need vitality. And we also assume that ethno-linguistic groups that have little vitality may eventually cease to exist if their vitality scores, you could say, go below a certain threshold of survivability. Now, as a tool of social analysis, group vitality can be used to compare and contrast the strength of language communities that are in contact. So it's a tool of social analysis, a cold tool. But of course, the group vitality can also be applied not just to linguistic and ethnic and religious groups in contact, but also with national minorities. So the construct of group vitality has been expanded not just to language group, but it's been actually used by researchers for religious group, linguistic groups, ethnic groups, all types of groups. It's quite amazing what has been occurring. Now we have 3 socio-structural variables that are likely to influence group vitality. And we originally organized them after some work in the lab, sort of looking at these things, at demographic, institutional control, and status factors. And this is what you often see in the talks, even here at this conference. So we have demographic factors. This has to do with everything you can measure with a census and more. Then you have status factors, which is something like the relative status of French and English in Quebec compared to the status of English and Welsh in Wales and in the UK. Okay? So, and also language planning. And we have institutional support, or if you want, an institutional control factors. And these are all the institutions that minorities use to equip themselves to survive in a majority environment. And of course, majority groups, dominant majority groups, also control a lot of these variables. And so there's often a battle about who gets the institutional support for the respective language group. Okay? Now, what we said as a general idea was that the more vitality you have on demographic factors, institutional support factors, and status factors, well, the more likely you are to have a strong group vitality or community vitality. You may be, or you may be very weak on all of these variables, or quite a lot of them. So that would make your community less strong. Now, the reason we organized it that way was simply that there was such a confusion and incredible number of variables that you could measure to compare language minorities with each other, that we needed to have a bit of order in it. So it doesn't mean that these, from a political, sociological, or even psychological perspective, are necessarily the way you should organize it or the way that ordinary folks organize it. But it was used as a tool, what we call a tool of social analysis. And it allowed us to do a lot of things, which hopefully I'll come to. So I'll start with a few words about each of the vitality constructs. So the status one has to do with the prestige and the language of the groups in contact. It can also be the historical prestige of a language or a community relative to another. So, for example, the Acadians are a minority. They were deported in the 18th century. Well, you could say, well, that's low historical vitality or status because, they were deported. And most of them, very few of them, ended up living in Acadia as a result of the British deportation. But what happened is that the Acadians reappropriated their deportation because so many came back, or some came back. They said, we survived our deportation. So that becomes a sort of a status-enhancing feature of your historical identity. I can't go. And of course, the key component of status vitality is anything that you do for language policies and language planning in favor of either the minority language or the majority language. Okay, and that can be either it could be tolerant or intolerant towards minorities. So, again, the more stuff you got on status vitality, the better it is for your group. Okay, and if it's running in your favor. Demographic vitality, so it's the sheer number of speakers and their distribution within the territory. And of course, the greater the demographic strength of a community, the greater the likelihood that that group will thrive as a distinctive unit. So what do we use for demographic variables? Well, all the things that luckily we have one of the best census in the world. So we have a lot of tools to measure things like the absolute number of minority and majority speakers in the community or in the region. We know a lot about the birth rate, the age pyramid, the amount of mixed marriages between, let's say, French and English, First Nations and English, the intergenerational transmission of the language from the parents to the children, how well is it occurring? We have a lot of tools to analyze that. The rate of emigration and immigration of that particular community in that particular territory, the concentration and the percentage of the speakers either in the region, in the province, or in the country. So one key feature about demographic vitality is the territorial unit. So in Quebec, the Francophones are an 85, the French mother tongue population is an 80% majority. But of course, the Francophones would say, yeah, but we're only 23% when you look at it from the Canadian perspective. And then if we think about North America, we say, well, we're a threatened minority because we're only 1.2 of the North American population. So the unit of analysis that you use to get to your demographic vitality is a territorial one. And of course, you choose it depending on your purposes. Okay, do you see the point of that? So it's about a control. So now we go into the institutional vitality. And it's defined as the degree of control one language group has over its own fate as a collective group. It's the degree basically of social power enjoyed by the language group 1 or A relative to the social power of the other group. And what we say, of course, and you've heard it before from an institutional support perspective, by the way, institutional support and control, well, Raymond Breton, back in the 70s and 80s, had institutional completeness. Well, we inspired ourselves from the great work of Raymond Breton at l'Université de Toronto, who was working on the institutional support or completeness of Francophones in Manitoba and in Saskatchewan and in Ontario. So it's a construct that we developed from that of Raymond Breton, and I owe this to Raymond for having done this. So it's that degree of control, and the more you have that control over your institutions, the more likely you are to survive as a community. So it's the dimension of vitality par excellence that a group needs to maintain and assert their development within a state or a private institution within a territory. So the language group will need control of their own national and municipal government if they can get it as a minority. They'll need control of aspects of their educational network, their health and social services, judicial system, commerce, business, police, military, mass media, culture, sports, and also some sort of constitutional control over their territory, okay, the right to be on that territory. So these are all elements that can contribute to the vitality of a group from an institutional control perspective. Group vitality can be used by minority activists to strategically mobilize for achieving greater in-group demography, institutional control, and status, thus improving their overall vitality. So when you look at this shopping list of variables under status, institutional control, and demography, well, a minority group has to be aware of their strengths and weaknesses on each one of those dimensions. Then, to act collectively to survive, they have to make choices, like Kate was saying this morning. You got to make choices about where am I going to put my energies as a linguistic minority to improve my institutional control, but on what? On education, on health and social services, or something else? Or maybe I'm going to work on my immigration from demography. I'll try to get more immigrants who are anglophones in Quebec so that I can bolster the anglophone minority on the Quebec territory. So, or I will fight for greater status in terms of language policies to protect my school system and my healthcare system. So you can see that the group vitality framework became and was used in very many minority groups across the world as also a heuristic, a method of deciding, okay, on which dimension must we work to get the most impact to survive as a linguistic community in this particular majority environment. So it becomes a tool of strategic analysis to decide how we're going to navigate to improve our group vitality to survive. So that's a classic use that I found over 40 years in all the research. There's about 2,000 papers in the world that have cited the group vitality framework, and there are very many communities and laws that have been built around the notion of vitality as a guiding tool. The other thing about group vitality is that it can be used by dominant majorities to strategically undermine the demographic, institutional, and status vitality of rival linguistic groups, contributing thus to their assimilation. So what we find around the world is that dominant majorities are incredibly smart and aware of how to harm the linguistic minority the most to undermine their vitality. So in the same way that the linguistic minority is very smart in deciding which dimension they need on their vitality to survive, the dominant majority is also very smart in knowing how to undermine the vitality of the group. So it is sometimes a zero-sum game, a battle between the linguistic minority and the dominant majority. And because the dominant majority has more tools of the state, it controls more institutions of the state than the minority, which often is deprived or has only a few domains of institutional control that it can muster to control a little bit. Usually the dominant majority is in the best position to undermine the vitality of language minorities. And of course, we've seen this. The most dramatic example in Canada has been the white Canadian settler dominant majority strategies to destroy the First Nation communities of this country since the moment of contact between First Nations and white settlers. Now, of course, the best scenario is when a dominant majority collaborates with their minorities to improve their vitality and foster social cohesion through diversity. So you can also use the group vitality framework to say, okay, me as a dominant secure majority, what can I do to improve the vitality of my different linguistic minorities on my territory so that we can foster some diversity and give them some institutional support, some status, and so that you can have a more cohesive society. So you can see that it can be used for good things and bad things. 5 minutes left? Wow. Well, I haven't started. Okay. Well, anyway, you get the picture of the vitality framework a bit, hopefully. I was going to give some examples. Well, we know that in the Official Languages Act, we have French and English as the two official languages. But when you look at the 1988 version, well, so the Canadian government did endorse the vitality framework in its policies. So, for example, you have enhancing the vitality of the English and French linguistic minority communities in Canada and supporting and assisting their development. So, Canadian government has used the vitality framework to help francophone minorities outside of Quebec and Anglophone minorities in Quebec for that. So I think I'm going to skip all my examples. I'm going to have 5 minutes. Well, so the dominant majority can have all types of feelings about being threatened also, or a minority, mixed minority-majority status could have feelings of threat. So there are a lot of psychological variables that come into the picture. Well, and the language laws are examples of status vitality, and we have, it's like our national sport. Look at all our language laws in Quebec. It's like hockey, So we have all of those, and we have all types of images about how we deal with language policies, and who are they for and by whom. So, so this old one from Aislinn. So the francophone majority has to empower itself. So the anglophone community say, yeah, well, they're coming our way, and that's the little card that they use to get our way. So we have all these things. So I'm going to skip all that. I'm going to try to go to... so I was giving examples of the effect of language laws on group vitality and in demographic vitality, etc. I might do one that is of interest. This is the exodus. So these are the Anglophone exodus period. We have all that well plotted with Canadian census data. In red is the net outflow of Anglophones from Quebec relative to Anglophones coming from the rest of Canada. And you can see that for all the census that we've had so far since 1966 to 2016, there's always been a net outflow of Anglophones from the province of Quebec, and also of allophones, but virtually none amongst Anglophones. So just an example of what those things are. And then what we find is in the press, there are elements of vitality that journalists don't think about that is vitality, but it becomes a social representation. So group vitality can also be a social representation of the strength and weakness of language minorities, and they create, you could say, a corpus of ideological perspectives or even just narratives, scripts about what's going on. So way back in 1984, when we think about Bill 101 and the Anglophone minority, you had an article in L'Actualité, is the French McLean-Hunter version, and entre l'exaspération et l'exode, les anglophones québécois perdent du poids politique, économique et démographique. So you see, right there we have institutional support. And then, mais dans leur peau, mal dans leur peau, la moitié d'entre eux pensent quitter le Québec. Well, that's demography. They're leaving the province. It's an option. So in just this little blurb, you get both institutional support and you have demographic vitality. So it's a construct that ordinary folks can pick up easily. So then we have, the reactions of Anglophones towards language laws. So I'm going to skip that. I'm going to try to go to... so then with 30 years of language planning, we have, for example, this is a chap I know, Michel Payet. He's a demographer at le Conseil supérieur de la langue française. And at one point he said, well, progrès continu with Bill 101. Nous assistons bel et bien à une progression de la vitalité du français au Québec. So the government officials say, yeah, I think we did very well with Bill 101. We reduced the vitality of the Anglophones and we increased the vitality of the Francophones. So we're winning. We did a good job. So it's working well. Also, on the institutional support front, you have Camille Lorrain, who said the ultimate goal of the Charter of the French language was to ensure that more and more Francophones seize power in business, that they become the directors and CEOs, and that the Quebecois economy be at last controlled by them. And when you look at the results of the Bill 101 measures, with French as the language of work, well, we find that the ownership of the Quebec economy by Francophone firms increased from 47% in 61 to 67% in 2003 and 75% in 2011. We find that the use of French by Francophone workers increased from 1971 to 2006. So these are things about group vitality in the institutional setting. So this is institutional vitality. So that's a good measure. And then you look at income. Well, income between groups is institutional support because it's related to the economy. And Camille Lorrain, when he crafted Bill 101, that's what he was looking for. So he was looking like what we have here. Individual annual median salary in 2001 in Quebec was Francophones 28,000, Anglophones 25, and Allophones 20,000. Then unemployment rate in Quebec in 2011, census, Francophones 6.9, Anglophones 9.4. Then we have individual annual median salary for 2016, and those trends are steady. 34,000 for Francophones as a median, Anglophones 31, Allophones 25. Okay, and the proportion of the population living under the poverty rate, well, it was higher for Anglophones than for Francophones in both 2011 and in 2011. So these are institutional support through all types of measures that has changed the economic power structure between the Francophone majority and the Anglophone minority. And that was the goal of Bill 101, which was a clear case of what we would consider the heuristic value of the vitality perspective. So I'm giving you a slight example of how we can use this. So you can measure it from the point of view of the majority, and you say, well, a lot of features of Bill 101 were successful in improving the vitality on all fronts of the Francophones, undermining that of the Anglophone. And then from the point of view of the Anglophone, well, of course, we've been the recipient of these efforts. So that's the story. So I think I'm going to stop here, and we're going to let Jan come through with another example, a more specific example of the application of the vitality framework to the Quebec City framework.
So moving on, for those of you who joined us after we started, we will keep some time after the presentations for questions. So Jan Warmke is a doctoral student in geography at Université Laval and a researcher at McGill University. Over the past 15 years, he has specialized in spatial analysis and online visualization of the parameters of access and utilization of health and education services by the OLMC across Canada, and especially in Quebec and in Ontario. The focus of his applied research initiatives is the development techniques that target the contextual and individual factors associated with actual and potential service utilization by the OLMC. His method has identified a local typology of OLMC vulnerability based on the principal social determinants of health. The method has been used to analyze OLMC education and health service users in Quebec and across Canada. So Professor Warmke will address his research on profiling vulnerable English-speaking communities, and more specifically children, I think, based on key social determinants of health. And as I mentioned, looking forward to the Q&A after the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard, for collaborating and setting me up and providing me. I'm the case study, which is supposed to look at the more practical, the more, let's say, concrete aspects of community vitality. And when I first started this, I was wondering how are we going to couch this? How are we going to look at community vitality, the construct, and how are we going to measure it? And Richard picked up right away on a number of things that I had been doing which fit directly into the construct, okay, and which permitted me then to say, oh, okay, so I've been working in the health system, I've been also working with the education system, but there is a link between them because I was working on the notion of vulnerability. And vulnerability has a number of indicators and variables and which are pertinent to both, okay, and which will influence community vitality at various different levels. So I proceeded. I was working with a model or construct called health access. And nowhere in this entire model, even though we cover demographic factors, institutional factors, environmental factors, et cetera, how people access health or whether they access any particular service is dependent on a large number of factors, okay? So as a concrete example of how people use services, okay, this has a direct impact on community vitality, but the health aspect will permit us to better understand maybe how these particular variables might be articulated and what could be done about them, okay? In other words, what kind of action. Okay, so the research that I had done was on Jeffrey Hale Hospital population. Jeffrey Hale Hospital is a hospital that's way over 100 years old. It was established in Quebec and has also developed, what's unique about it, has developed a database of its clientele which is crossed by language, okay, and has been maintained. They've been very diligent in maintaining the language variable. It's the only one in Quebec that I know of, okay? The only other one that I know of is at Hôpital Montfort with the Francophone side, and I've also worked with that particular database as well. So if you want concrete examples of how English or French language users are using the health system, okay, we have that particular data, but we need constructs and we need ways of actually applying this and finding how we're going to get that information into action that's going to provide us with a better quality of life, better health, better education, and so forth, and equity. So I'm working at Jeffrey Hale, and my objective there was to look at a very concrete problem. with the new population health approach, after Bill 10 and 25, there was a number of bills that came through. There was a health reform, and each one of the CLSCs and the service here is at Jeffrey Hale Hospital is for English people. They're bilingual, essentially. So they had to provide services to the Anglophone population. They also had to say, well, how well are they doing this? And who is using it? And who are you missing? Okay? And the population health approach requires to look at the gaps, to find out where are the people not getting the services perhaps that they should be getting. And there you can see possibly a very direct link with community vitality. Okay, so I was looking at this, and there are 4 particular services that we're looking at. And my way of getting at it was to say, well, I can look at any particular variable. I can take where all of these clients are, I can look at their background, and I can focus on 1, 2, or 3, or 4. But to realize that this all occurs within a context. The population health approach is contextual. It has to do with neighborhoods. It has to do with a space where people interact, okay, and which has a social complexity, and that's what I'm getting at here. That vulnerability is part of that social complexity, which contributes to community vitality, and consequently also health outcomes, and also educational outcomes. So we had to develop data that would permit us to get a handle on where those gaps are. Okay, how can we measure it? And I decided to use a technique. I applied a technique which had already been developed in 2006, which as a geographer I was familiar with, but it was fairly avant-garde, but which I then applied to the user data, but also contextualizing it within the census data of social determinants of health. So I'm taking the clients, and I'm also looking at the social determinants of health, okay, which determine health of the general population, and saying, okay, if I find a lot of Anglophones in a particular place, maybe in that space at the same time, those Anglophones are not as well off. And maybe are they being serviced or are they not being serviced by the particular services that are being offered by Jeffrey Hale Hospital or by the educational system, for all that matter. Okay, just to give you a sense of what that population is, okay, we're looking at a population of roughly 14,000 people. Notice that the age groups here, there was an increase from 2011 to 2016, okay? This is very unusual, okay? Which means that there was a migration. As a matter of fact, I know there 25% of the population changes every 5 years. So there's a constant flux of population. The systems, health system, educational system, has to adjust to that, the social service system as well. This has an impact on community vitality of the local population as well. The population is roughly 1.8% of the total population in the region. Okay, it's spread out very thinly with clusters, pockets, geographic clusters in particular areas. How do you service that particular population? How do you measure, okay, what their vulnerability is, and how do you address those particular measures, okay? There are a lot of challenges involved, but there are techniques, and this is one of the techniques that are being used right now that I'm going through, okay? You'll also notice there's a slight increase in the less than 15-year-old population group right here, okay? Which probably is a reflection of the fact that there was in-migration in the working age group. These are probably professionals moving into the area. As a matter of fact, I know that they are. So I checked, I crossed that particular data. And their families moving in, okay? So that puts another weight on the entire system as well to respond to the needs of these newly arriving families. Let's compare that to the Anglophones in the rest of the province. Look at this. We have a considerably larger proportion of the population in the Quebec City region of that 25-44-year age group. In other words, there's a specificity to the population in that local area, okay? And I've been hammering away at this idea, one size does not fit all. One solution does not fit all. We have to adapt to the particular conditions that we have in any particular place. In other words, policies have to be designed with that capacity to adapt right from the start, okay? This is a clear indication of this as I go through each one of the communities of Quebec, which I'm not going to do today, but I do have it on my computer, and the Secretariat also has it. So we know that. The other thing I wanted to point out, in the less than 15-year-old group, you have 11.8% in Quebec, whereas the provincial norm is 15.2%. So we're actually poor. We have a low number, okay, of children in that area, which once again underlines the fact that the population moving into the Quebec City area is a working population, probably professionals or people that are looking for jobs or moving in that particular area for jobs. Okay, so that's just a brief overview. The method that I'm using here, I first of all described where they are geographically. I used a number of techniques for that, and I'm not going to get into details. If you wish to hear about it, I can definitely go on for many hours about doing this, but if you're not a geographer or if you're not an analyst, you may not be that might be not of interest. What I essentially did, I took the metropolitan region, I took 178 census tracts, which are small areas, roughly about 8,000 people, 3,000 to 8,000 people, and they approximate a neighborhood, okay? And we have census data by this. And I can geocode this. And geocoding is a very important step. I do it for a large number of people. When you geocode, you're actually locating where people are, where events are, and then you can make decisions about it, okay? It's a very empowering step, okay? So here I've taken the data, and I've taken a number of variables, and I've geocoded them by 178 census tracts to be able to come up with a picture of what the neighborhoods are in terms of vulnerability. And I'm using a technique, essentially, which reduces the number of variables. I started out with 81, it came on down to 15, I ended up with 9, because I reduced the redundancy. There's a whole series of statistical procedures that I had to use, but it permits me then to actually map this out and say, we have these neighborhoods or these regions, okay, which do not coincide with administrative regions or administrative boundaries, but this is where you find the Anglophones who are vulnerable, okay? So this permits me then to come up with this, okay? Which really may not make a lot of sense to a lot of people. So I'm going to try to simplify this for everybody. But essentially, I came up with 5 different profiles, actually initially 9, and where certain things tend to group together geographically and also are close to it. This is a technique, by the way, which is used by Amazon and Google, and they use it since the 1970s, essentially, okay? And it involves a certain number of algorithms which are used in artificial intelligence because it loops over and over and learns from itself and gradually grows and so forth. So, and it's all automated. I don't do it on my scrap paper. But here's one of the dimensions, okay, one of the profiles that I created, okay? So instead of taking one variable, okay, I've taken a number of variables, the VCT 160, et cetera, et cetera. These are all particular variables. As you can see, these are box plots. Inside the box, you have 50% of the population, 50% of the answers, or let's say to the questions of the census or whatever, 50% are found here, okay? If the red dot is inside here, it's fairly close to the median. The median is in the middle, okay? So 50% is lower, 50% is above. What we want to see is what's high or very low. As you can see, some of these dots, the red dots, show that for that particular variable, their values in those particular areas are much higher. So we've created a profile here. We've created a typology, okay, of a number of variables, okay? 256, VO256, is the official language minority community. These are the Anglos. So in this particular case here, they are in the 4th quartile, which means there's a very high proportion compared to everybody else that is found in this particular area. We actually have 3 areas that we'll be able to create, 3 profiles that contain Anglophones. So this is what it looks like, essentially. Okay, so how do I decipher this? You see on the left-hand side, you see VCT4, et cetera. Those are those particular variables. This is the common definition for them. Immigrants, okay? Total population of visible minorities, okay? Also, indigenous origin, okay? Origine autochtone. no certificate, diploma, or degree. Scolarity, okay? The amount of education that somebody has. Unemployment, okay? VCT 39, I believe, yeah. Major repairs to housing required. In other words, they're living in neighborhoods where they need repairs, old areas, okay? So it's the quality of the environment that we're looking at, okay? Low income, okay, VCT 160. Single parent family, and official language minority, okay? And I associate official language minority to see if it was not going to be redundant. It's slightly redundant with some of the others. In other words, it follows the same path. There's a correlation, so we have to be careful how we interpret it. But essentially, it was quite strong, the relationship, and we were capable of looking at it. Here are 5 different groups. Look at group number 2, okay? It's in red. Where you have a 4, it means that there's a high representation of that particular variable, okay? So a high number of immigrants, high number of visible minorities, okay, it's in the 4th quartile, or, well, actually going towards the 4th quartile, so it's really a very high number. A high number of unemployed people, okay? An above average number of housing repairs required, above average number of people that have low income, and a slightly below average amount of single parent families. In other words, there are families in there, okay? Here, very, very low number of people without without any particular certificate. In other words, this is an area which is the inverse. It has a high number of people who have a higher level of education. So, high education, immigrants, visible minorities, English, and a little bit of housing here. There's a profile of a neighborhood. This is a type of context in which you have issues. So the question that arises after that is, well, what do we do with this, okay? How does the health system handle this? So we want to look at it a little bit more closely. We want to look at it by the types of issues that they were looking at. These are 1,167 people that are receiving services at Jeffrey Hale Hospital. I took all these people, I geocoded them, I mapped them out. I looked also at how many service calls they had, interventions they had in the field. So this is the number of interventions by the area of activity, okay? So you notice right away that psychosocial services is the major one, okay? It comes out, this is an area, okay, whether it's stress, we don't know what's causing it, but these people, these particular Anglophone users or English language service users are exhibiting a need for that particular type of service. Home service, soins d'infirmière à domicile, and jeune famille, okay, young families and so forth, okay? Those are the 3 major particular areas that are being serviced. These are the types of, this is the breakdown of those particular services, broken down into 4 major areas. And then when you map it out, okay, here, right here, here's that second group, okay? Right here, English, immigrants, higher education, unemployment, okay? So we actually have an area, okay, where we can say we have a vulnerable population. Notice that it overlies most of CLSC Sainte-Foy, but we have other groups that are over here that are going down here, and they cross the administrative boundaries of the health region. So how do you handle that? It creates a challenge. Same thing with educational boundaries and so forth. All sorts of boundaries where people would like, that administer programs, like everybody to sort of like, line up on the boundaries so we won't have to handle the overlap, because then we're creating a gap in a certain sense. We're providing services in one area and not in the other, okay? So, these are the users. This is where the users of all the services for the hospital are concentrated. And these are the number of interventions, okay, by those users. In other words, some users are using a lot of the service on a regular basis. This is a close-up of the city center. And notice, this overlaps that area, that group 2, considerably well. In other words, they're responding to the needs. So the answer there to the question, are we responding to needs? Definitely, okay? They're definitely responding to the needs of that population here. They're getting a penetration rate of 1,000 to 1,500 interventions per 1,000 people, okay, English population, which means it's very good, but much less so in the areas in the periphery, okay? And it shows the gaps. So we're capable of actually targeting the gaps and seeing where this, where further needs, they're on that question right now. I'm going to be tackling that when I get back to work next week. Okay, so to come back to my little diagram here, okay, I think there has to be a link between these two, okay? We have to look at how the information that we get here on the population and the vulnerability or other issues can be shared by the education system with the construct of community vitality in mind, in other words, that particular context. Okay, so I've quickly gone through a large number of things. It's very, very detailed, a lot of little particular details. I've tried to give you an overview of this. And I really appreciate, Richard, for the work that you have done. And I encourage you to let's say, look at, Richard, you didn't go through all your slides. But if you wish, they will be online. And you feel free to look at them and possibly ask questions. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you also to Dr. Bourhis, who is very enlightening. I think we have a healthy number of minutes left for questions. So I would like to open the floor. Yes, please.
Thank you to both of them. At the moment, I'm living with Richard, so I won't ask him a question. I ask him privately over a bottle of wine. But that I very much appreciate. I'm also a geographer. Your work is presumably an individual analysing a complex of factors.
Yeah.
Does the system employ people like you to systematically do time series analyses of these issues so that they can improve their policy outcomes? Or are you a one-off?
Well, I'm a bit of a wild card, I guess, because I've been doing this for 30 years. Okay, I've known Richard for 30 years. I've known the work right from the start, on the English and on the French system as well. And I developed this, but there was no structure to maintain that. Okay, that's why I created my own company. Okay, it permitted to give me a little structure to do research and development, essentially. Okay,
Shall I say why I'm asking? Because we've heard a lot of evidence-based policy. But unless you have people like this man to actually interrogate what's actually happening on the ground by space and time, the evidence is abstract and generic and rhetorical. This is evidence, isn't it?
Well, I think there's a need for it.
Yeah.
Okay, there's that little 1% that you need that particular bit of information. To me, it's a building block.
Yeah.
Okay,
But I want to know with it.
focusing on the critical building blocks and being maybe just on the horizon all the time permits us to get at issues before they become a real major issue, okay? Before it becomes a major social problem, for example, okay? How do we sense those? We expect our education, I work closely with educational institutions and so forth, and I think that's going to be my prerogative. I'm a retired college professor, so I mean, yeah, I love doing this, so it permits me to work on it. And I know Richard loves doing the kind of work he does here. So the collaboration that we have, okay, I think it permits us to spin off, and develop things for community vitality, for the community. Okay, because when I work on this, I know a number of people are going to be impacted. I know that funds are going to go in someplace. When I first came to Canadian Heritage and William Flock fielded me to work at Canadian Heritage to develop a data model on official language minorities in Canada. Okay, they had a budget of $1.4 billion, okay, but they didn't know where all the people were. A simple question, very simple. So where are these people? Where is the need and what needs? Okay, there are various levels of things that have to be targeted. That's it. So that's how I started off, and I just slowly moved on. Sorry, maybe off topic.
Thank you. Other questions?
Part observation, part question perhaps for Richard. My name is David McFall, principal of a large urban elementary school in Western Quebec. So my school is located minutes from Ottawa. Literally, we can see the Parliament buildings. You throw a stone, you can be there. And I hear a lot about the Quebec City narrative, the Montreal narrative. I know a lot about the eastern and our northern communities. I don't often hear about the Western Quebec narrative because it is a bit of an anomaly. And being the institutional and community gateway for a lot of inward migration into Quebec from Ontario, it does have its own narrative. The reasons that it probably doesn't get the same documentation is because depending if the people stay. Because many people move into Gatineau, Western Quebec, and then they leave again. And the difference I've seen over the last 10 years is that those that come into Quebec from Ontario, whether they're migrants or were immigrants and migrants, they tend to, the ones that buy homes in Western Quebec stay. And the ones that rent may rent again and then just as quickly leave. So we've almost got two groups of migrants coming into Western Quebec. Based on economics, it's almost a Ontario economic refugees, or those future homeowners wanting to purchase because it's cheaper rent. But there is a story in Western Quebec, and the English population is growing, and our school board, Western Quebec School Board, has gone up by 10% in the last 6 years, from 6,400 students to 7,300. So there is also a story in Western Quebec. In a lot of your research, Richard, do you, finally get to the question, is that taken into any consideration, or is it still mostly Quebec City and Montreal statistics? Statistics come from census and birthplace. Just wonder if you could highlight, or if you've got any opinion on the Western Quebec narrative or story.
No, I don't have any data on that because it hasn't been asked. But it's the unit of analysis so the vitality framework, you can break it down to the Outaouais region, and then you can use all the vitality factors as the context in which these forces that you're describing in your school, what's happening in your school with various First Nations and everybody that's there. So it's only a tool of analysis. So if somebody would come in and they would want to have a study of what's happening in your community, then we would apply. We would look at all these variables, the institutional support variables, the demographics, and the status. We would decide which variables are most important for what you're interested in, and let's say for what we're interested in that region of the Outaouais. Then we may get Jan to do some of the mapping, but we could also do other types of work, some surveys with some key service providers. And then so we would look at it as a territorial unit that has its ecology. And the heuristic value of the vitality is simply, well, okay, am I covering all the institutional support variables? Which one are the most important for that community? So I remember from your talk, your school, you have some First Nations people coming in. So let's say you're saying, well, are these vulnerable members of your school system, or are they coming in from elsewhere? So then you would craft a whole analysis using that territorial unit as the context in which you can have a beneficial impact on improving some outcomes for either the students or subgroups of the students, depending on the question you have. And that has been done elsewhere in the world with the unit of analysis, the territorial unit of analysis. Okay?
Thanks very much.
No, I just wanted to mention that a lot of that information is available to a certain degree with the Secretariat at the moment. I'm helping the Secretariat develop a database which would permit people to take and address that issue, okay, through initiatives like what Richard is doing. He could use that information, okay, and there's somebody here from the Secretariat could actually talk more about that than me, maybe. In any case, thank you.
Kate Lemaitre, thank you both very much. That's so fascinating to look at those figures and those data. Something that Richard said and David sort of added to it, I'm not even sure if I've got a question, but you might want to comment on this. You mentioned, Richard, the white the white settlers who marginalized the indigenous people. And then a little bit later, you talked about the majority population advantaging the minority population for the mutual benefit of both. I'm seeing a parallel there, obviously, between what we, quotation marks, did to the indigenous peoples, not just in Quebec. And I'm thinking about the minority-majority English-Franco relationship. I think we're still guilty of it. There's a party up north right now in Kuujjuaq from the various ministries trying to sort out some of the problems that are going on there with the horrible suicide rate and the various other difficulties. And I know they're not going to say, do it this way and everything will be okay for you. They're not going to do that. I don't want a majority population saying that to me either as a minority. Can you see a parallel there? Is there anything that we should be wary of?
Okay, so the best thing that could be done in this context is simply giving some tools of analysis for the communities. So I would just come in and you say, well, there's a big toolbox out there. One tool is maybe you want to look at your community from a vitality perspective. And you can identify their strong and weak, your strengths and weaknesses in that context. And then you have a relationship with the white community, the dominant white community. And then you would work on, what can be done to improve the situation at a point where you feel it's most critical. So, but in that context of First Nations, usually, we're not talking about expanding, well, we're looking at just helping people survive physically. So you're in a different mindset than when you're into the language planning literature, where you're looking at, trying to improve language facilities and language services. Well, of course, language would be important, but it would be the community that would use the tool to decide, and Joshua Fishman used to do that as well, in a sense, was to say, well, okay, here are some tools of analysis that I can give you, and then you guys sort it out, because you're the ones who will decide what is most important for your situation. And then if they need some input from professionals or people who have been involved in that, then we can shoulder their goals and help them with those goals. But that's all it is. I mean, that vitality framework and some of the tools even for the mapping, these are tools of analysis. And it depends also when the community is ready to use those tools. Maybe they'll say, well, these are not the tools we've been using traditionally, so we're not ready for them. We would like to wait maybe another decade or maybe another generation to actually get into that. So they would be their decision. But here, the only thing we can do is just say, well, here are some tools for your toolbox, and you make decisions about how you're going to use the toolbox and the tools within it. That's all we can do. Yeah.
Did you want to address this as well? You good? Okay, so in the back, and then thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is at a policy level. So obviously when we look at Bill 101 as an effective policy tool, and even if you look in other countries and historically in Canada with our own legislation surrounding First Nations, there seems to be a continued trend around improving vitality at the expense of other groups. So I'm wondering, as we, the English minority, try to make advances in policy to assure our own vitality, do you have any thoughts on how we might do that without further contributing to the disenfranchisement of allophone communities and others?
Yeah, there's from an attitude perspective, we have very often we even have a scale for it. It's sort of it's a zero-sum scale. So how do you see your intergroup situation as being zero-sum as opposed to being not a question of zero-sum? What I gain, you lose. And that's often a question of territory, by the way, and that's what First Nations suffered. The territorial disputes are terrible because inevitably, what one gains territorially is lost by the other just because of the surface area of the territory. But in these other domains of institutional support and institutional control, well, you can have shared control. So in other words, you don't need to have a zero-sum framework on it. But unfortunately, a lot of dominant groups, the first dominant majorities, if you let them be what they are, they will have a tendency to basically advance their own group, very often at a disadvantage of the other. And the only measure we have, or some of the measures we have to limit that tendency, are things like constitutions, which protect the right of minorities from the tyrannies of the majority. So, and we have human rights codes. We have, and then we can, then we try to sort of document that, yes, you could have 3 or 4 minorities with a majority, and each one could have quite a lot of institutional control and status, and it would not undermine the position of the dominant group. So we have to sort of show that it's possible to share control, and that would improve, and as I was mentioning, the idea that diversity can be a source also of cohesion if you give people space for being who they are. So, but that's a value judgment. That's a political position. That's, you know, in political science, you say, well, you're that type of person. So Kim Lika would say one thing, somebody else, another politician would say, or another political scientist would say something else. So there's different ways of sharing that institutional control that most communities want to have for themselves, to the degree that they identify as a group and that they see that they are different groups vying for very often the same limited resources. And that's the challenge of political science. It's a challenge of the judiciary, of our constitutions, and eventually of the attitude of politicians who sometimes drive the feeling of threat, the feeling of competition between the majorities and the minorities, or do the opposite. They say, we can share. We can share. We can have another approach. But there we're into values, we're into belief systems, and we depend on our leaders to be towards a more cohesive point of view than towards a divisive one. And that's beyond what we can do with our toolboxes. It becomes political, it becomes ideological.
Thank you very much. That is a very timely comment as well.
My name is Michael Ayudi. I've been involved in the politics and administration of services, particularly in English in Quebec, for a long time. And my question was sort of inspired particularly by the slides that you showed about changes in vitality and comparative vitality over the last 40 years or so in Quebec. And in part, you've already commented on my question, because while I was waiting, the subject came up. But the question started off being, is vitality basically a zero-sum game? Because if it is, then that would lead to tactics on the part of one group or another if the reality is that it's a zero-sum game. And maybe in some places it is a zero-sum game and in other places it's not. So I'd be interested to know, like there's been decades of observation now about this. If it's not a zero-sum game, then that would lead to other tactics, depending on what group you're a member of. And so I'd be interested to hear your comments about that and what those tactics might be. And the last part of my question, which just came up in the last 2 minutes, is can the situation about vitality migrate from being a zero-sum game to being something else other than a zero-sum game? So.
What we find is when you empower minorities to be able to fulfill themselves in whatever way they wish, including getting more institutional support for their educational or healthcare or social services institutions, when you empower them with those possibilities, and then of course including language or depending on the social context where you do this, we know that they become more efficient, more productive members of society, as a collectivity. So when you give people some empowerment, or we've seen this with the changing relations between males and females. When we empowered women to be able to have all the positions that were originally restricted to male, what we found was that everybody gained. Everybody gained from that. And so it was plus, it was win-win. And the challenge is to convince, let's say, comfortable majorities that if they do some power sharing, and then you can actually bolster the productivity and the creativity of that particular society that's, as you enshrine some diversity and some what we call institutional diversity. So as you build institutional diversity, you stabilize the position of minorities because you give them institutions that they can control. And by having this contact with the majorities, with trust being built, then you find that all the subgroups become more productive. They do more for the society. So you have to convince people that by doing this power sharing, so it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, you actually increase the productivity for everybody. And it's a productivity that can be in terms of social cohesion, in terms of economics. It could be in terms of delivering better health services to different types of communities. So I think that it becomes, again, a question of values and a question of how do you convince people that it's actually a win-win situation rather than a zero-sum situation. But we've seen I think one good example you can use that everybody, in a room, you get 50% women, 50% men, and you say, what have we done with the empowering of women in society? Well, everybody gained. So if everybody gained with women, which is half the population of the world, half the sky, then surely you can do it with other communities that are, other than male, female. So it means you can do it. We can benefit. But you have to convince people of that. If they're not convinced, they're gonna smother the minorities. They're just gonna see them as a threat or as suspicious minorities or threatening. They dilute the authenticity of our majority. They dilute the spread of our language. They dilute, so you have all the negativity that goes with the zero-sum thinking.
I just want to add to that because I've been confronted with this very, very frequently because you can see the strategies being built around all sorts of things and a lot of rhetoric and so forth. But I come at it from a very operational point of view, okay? In other words, I get the information, okay? And then get everybody into the room and turn up the heat. In other words, you see what the information is. In this particular case, okay, there is a mechanism called the community table, table de concertation, which permits people, okay, from various different walks of life, and a lot of people from the English community, from the representative of the English community, to sit at the Jeffrey Hale St. Bridget's Home table. And these are the people, the directors and so forth, these are the people that are going to say, well, what are we going to do with this information? Obviously, okay, we have an issue here, and everybody agrees on it. There's a consensus, okay? You don't strategize too much. You try to strategize. You work together towards a solution after that particular point. Yes, there will always be strategies, and I think it's really important to do that because we have to be able to position ourselves with respect to information. But I think there are mechanisms now that are available. This is just one small example. I've worked in education as well, where I've drawn maps, and all of a sudden it was very clear, okay? It's all there. You can see, oh yeah, these people are here, the need is there, resources are here. Oh, well, what's the issue? Who can best satisfy this particular need? And I think when you get people working towards a solution together, they're not trying to pull themselves apart in various different ways. I think that's one of the challenges that the English community here has, okay, because it's a series of different communities from different interests and so forth, and I think that's what's going to be challenging in the future.
So please join me in thanking Professor Wanke and Professor Bourhis.